The rain had recently stopped, but the world still carried that damp weight that makes silence feel denser. Inside her car, fingers resting on the steering wheel, Helen observed something her eyes couldn't immediately translate. On the lot across the wire fence, amidst shapeless mountains of discarded items that belonged to no one, a man hunched over torn sacks, while a small boy waited nearby, holding something barely visible against the grey afternoon light. Before we delve into this story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're tuning in from. May this moment stir your heart and mind. Helen couldn't explain why she hit the brakes. There was no practical reason, no appointment on that almost forgotten road on the outskirts of town. Her hands remained on the wheel, fingers clutching the leather with a senseless tension. The car's engine purred softly, as if it too awaited a decision she didn't know how to make. But something in that scene stopped her, like a whisper demanding attention. The fogged window made everything more diffuse, more cinematic, as if the reality outside belonged to another time, another world that existed parallel to hers but never quite touched it. The man wore a faded shirt that had once been blue, and his movements held a slowness that wasn't laziness, but economy. Every gesture seemed calculated to expend the minimum necessary energy, like someone who had learned the body is the only tool that cannot be replaced. The boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, remained by his side with a patience that didn't match his age. His dark hair was windswept, and his clothes, though worn, were clean, revealing a care that survived despite the circumstances. He held a broken object with both hands, occasionally glancing at his father like someone awaiting a sign, a permission, a word that never came, because between them, words were unnecessary. The silence that connected them was more eloquent than any conversation. Helen felt her own heart change rhythm. It wasn't pity, though it might have seemed so. It was something stranger, more unsettling. It was as if that scene were revealing a truth she had spent her entire life avoiding. The stillness of those two held a dignity her own accomplishments had never managed to produce. She stayed there too long, long enough for the man to lift his eyes once, briefly, without curiosity or hostility, just the automatic acknowledgement of a presence that didn't belong there. Then he returned to work, and the boy continued waiting, and Helen finally released the brake and drove away, with the feeling that she had left something behind without knowing what. That night, in the glass and marble penthouse that dominated the city from a dizzying height, Helen couldn't sleep. The metropolis's lights twinkled like empty promises through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She sat in an armchair that had cost more than that man probably earned in a year, looking at the lights below without truly seeing them. The air conditioning kept the temperature perfectly controlled, but she felt a cold that came from within, from a place no heater could reach. The image of the boy holding the broken object wouldn't leave her. There was something in that scene that was both painful and necessary, like a truth that hurts but heals. And she couldn't stop thinking about the father's gaze, that impossible combination of weariness and vigilance that seemed to define his entire existence. Her husband arrived late, as usual. Richard walked in talking on his phone about numbers and projections, placed an automatic kiss on her forehead, and disappeared into his office. Helen remained in the armchair, feeling the weight of a nameless solitude. They had lived together for 15 years, but it had been a long time since they truly inhabited the same space. Each lived in their own orbit, crossing paths only for the perfunctory moments their shared life demanded. The next day, without planning it, Helen returned. The excuse she invented for herself was vague. Something about checking on a rural property that never existed, about confirming an address that didn't need confirmation. But deep down, in that place where lies don't survive, she knew she was going back to them, to the man and the boy who inhabited the forgotten lot. This time she parked closer. The sun was still fighting the clouds, and the smell of the landfill seeped through the car's vents. An acidic odor she expected to be unbearable, but which, strangely, seemed less aggressive than she'd imagined. Perhaps because now she was prepared. Perhaps because the smell of truth was different from the smell of fear. Around her, the lot stretched like a map of human discards, mountains of materials that told stories no one wanted to hear anymore. There was a strange order within that chaos, an organization she would begin to understand with time. The man noticed her immediately. His eyes lifted with the same brevity as the day before, but this time they lingered a second longer. It wasn't curiosity yet, but it wasn't indifference either. It was something in between, a caution that came from someone who had learned not to trust unexpected presences. Then he averted his gaze and continued working, maintaining a distance that seemed forged from pride, weariness, and a quiet dignity that wouldn't easily break. Helen got out of the car. She hadn't planned it, but her feet seemed to know what to do before her mind decided. The ground was damp, and her Italian leather shoes sank slightly into the mud. She didn't care. She walked to the wire fence and stood there observing, without trying to cross the invisible boundary that separated their worlds. The boy was the first to approach. Not too close, just a few steps, enough to study her with that clear curiosity of children who haven't yet learned to feign disinterest. He was now carrying a mended toy, something that had once been a small truck but had been reconstructed with pieces from various origins, forming a hybrid creature that worked despite its impossible appearance. Helen smiled, and the boy smiled back. It was a brief, silent moment, but it established something, a tiny bridge over the abyss that separated their universes. The father watched from a distance without approaching. His eyes went from his son to the woman and back, measuring, calculating, protecting. Helen understood the gesture. He didn't know who she was, what she wanted, why she was there. And a man living in those conditions quickly learned that free kindness was rarely truly free. She didn't try to speak, not that day. She simply watched for a few minutes, letting her presence become familiar before demanding anything. Then she waved briefly at the boy, got into her car, and drove away. In the days that followed, Helen returned, always at the same time, always parking in the same spot, always remaining on the boundary without trying to cross it. The ritual established itself without words, a silent routine that no one questioned because no one knew how to question it. As time passed, she began to notice details that had previously escaped her. The man worked with precise methodology, separating materials into categories only he understood, accumulating small piles that would later be sold or exchanged for basic necessities. The boy helped when he could, but spent most of his time fixing things. That's what he did with the broken objects he found. He restored a form of life to them. Helen discovered the boy's name was Ben. His father was Joe. She also learned that Joe had had a different life before, a house, a job, a wife. But something had happened, something no one mentioned directly, and now only he and the boy remained, and that lot where the world discarded what it no longer wanted. The transformation was slow, almost imperceptible. Helen began to arrive earlier, to stay longer. One day she brought water, and Joe accepted it with a brief nod, without thanking her aloud because an audible thanks would have signified something he wasn't yet ready to admit. Another day she brought fruit, and Ben ate it with a restrained joy that broke her heart in a way she couldn't explain. The visits began to bother those close to her. Richard noticed her prolonged absences, the extra miles on the car's odometer, the clothes that came back smelling different. He didn't ask direct questions, because direct questions would demand answers, and answers could change things he preferred to keep as they were. But the silence between them, which had once been merely empty, began to acquire a different texture. a tension that hadn't existed before. Helen's friends also noticed. At Sunday brunches, at charity luncheons that served more to display jewelry than to help anyone, comments began to surface. First veiled, then more direct. Questions about what she stood to gain, about why she insisted on helping people who perhaps didn't even want to be helped, about what drove her to spend her precious time in a place that reeked of decay. Helen listened without responding, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she knew any answer would be misunderstood. How to explain that there, on that forgotten lot, she found something her entire life of achievements had failed to produce. How to say that Joe's silent dignity was more real than all the medals and diplomas hanging on her apartment walls. How to admit that Ben's smile, when he managed to fix something that seemed irrecoverable, was worth more than all the expensive gifts she received on special occasions. The words hurt more than Helen admitted. Every criticism, every judging glance, every question disguised as concern, but paradoxically, each wound only made her return to the same spot. Something there was true in a way the rest of her life hadn't been for a long time. And that truth, even painful, was what kept her returning. The bond between the three grew slowly, like a plant needing time to root before showing its leaves. Helen learned to respect the rhythm of that relationship, not to force proximities that weren't yet ready to exist. Joe continued to maintain his distance, but the glances he cast no longer carried only distrust. There was a silent recognition there, an acceptance that needed no words to be understood. Ben was the catalyst. Children have this ability to cross walls that adults build over decades. He began to show Helen the objects he fixed, approaching the fence with a shyness that diminished each day. First, they were simple things, a mended toy, a plastic piece that had gained a new function. Then came more elaborate creations, small improvised mechanisms that worked despite all logic saying they shouldn't. Helen was enchanted, but mostly touched, to see Joe observing his son from afar. There was a pride in that gaze that needed no demonstration. A love that manifested in constant vigilance, in attention to detail, in the way he organized his work so that Ben always had time to be a child, even when childhood seemed impossible in that setting. Sometimes, when the boy was particularly focused on a creation, Helen noticed Joe stop what he was doing just to watch. These were brief moments, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention, but she had learned to perceive them. They were the pauses of a father who knew his son deserved more, but who gave everything he could with what he had. One afternoon, Helen asked to enter, not with words, but with a gesture. She pointed to the improvised wooden gate and looked at Joe with a silent question in her eyes. He hesitated, his shoulders tensed, and for a moment she feared she had gone too far, had broken the delicate balance they had built. But then Ben ran to his father and said something she couldn't hear, and Joe finally nodded affirmatively once, briefly. The smell was different inside, more present, more complex. There were layers to that atmosphere, stories of things that were once important and now lay forgotten. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, a mix of compacted dirt and debris that demanded attention with every step. Helen took a deep breath and didn't recoil. She walked slowly among the organized piles, observing the methodology Joe applied to the chaos. Everything had a place, a reason, a possibility of redemption. Metals on one side, plastics. On another, papers in piles, separated by color and texture. It was a system she never would have imagined existing in a place like that, and this discovery fascinated her deeply. Ben guided her to his special corner. It was a small space, protected by a tarp Joe had improvised to create shade. There the boy kept his creations, his reconstructed treasures. Helen crouched down to his level and looked at each object with genuine attention. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pretense. It was real admiration for the intelligence that transformed trash into possibility. Joe watched closely now. His eyes went from his son to the woman, measuring reactions, searching for signs of falsehood that might justify his original distrust. But he found only what Helen offered: presence. A presence that demanded nothing, that didn't judge, that was simply there, witnessing the dignity they had built despite everything. The following days brought a subtle change in their dynamic. Helen began to participate more actively, not in the heavy labor, but in the moments surrounding it. She brought snacks they shared, sitting on improvised crates. She listened to the few stories Joe allowed himself to tell, fragments of a previous life. He doled out carefully, like someone administering a bitter medicine. That's how she learned about Martha, Joe's wife, Ben's mother. There was no formal conversation, no moment of confession. There were just pieces of information that fit together over the weeks, like a jigsaw puzzle that assembles itself when you stop forcing the pieces. Martha had died 3 years prior, an illness that started small and grew too fast, devouring hopes along with cells. Doctors had given deadlines that shortened with each appointment, prognoses that grew darker with every test. Joe had a job then, a rented house, a life that followed the expected script of a hard-working man with a family to support. But the medical bills consumed everything. First, the savings they had put away for Ben's future. Then, the furniture, sold one by one in a silent liquidation of dreams. Then the house itself, surrendered to the landlord when the back rent became unpayable. When Martha was gone, in an early hospital morning that smelled of disinfectant and farewell, she took with her the structure that supported Joe. He tried to start over, but the job market had no patience for a man shattered by grief who needed to care for a young child alone. Doors closed before they even opened, and each refusal was a blow he absorbed in silence. The landfill wasn't a choice. It was what remained when all other doors closed. Helen listened to these stories without interrupting, without offering easy solutions or words of comfort that would sound hollow. She understood that Joe didn't want solace. He just wanted to be heard, to have his story recognized by someone who didn't judge him. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the piles of discards, painting everything in shades of orange and shadow, Helen saw Joe refuse an object another scavenger offered. It was something that seemed useful, a tool in good condition that would facilitate his work. But Joe refused with a firm, almost brusque gesture. Helen didn't understand immediately. Only later, observing other interactions, did she perceive the pattern. Joe refused anything that suggested pity. He accepted fair trades, negotiations between equals, but free offers, gestures that carried the weight of compassion. Those he rejected as if they were insults. This detail changed something in Helen. The wealth she carried on her wrist, in her clothes, in her posture, no longer seemed as solid as before. There was a fragility in her that Joe, even with nothing, didn't possess. He knew who he was. He knew the value of his dignity and wouldn't sell it for convenience. Helen, surrounded by comforts, didn't have that certainty about herself. There was a day when Ben disappeared for a few minutes, enough for Helen to perceive Joe's contained despair. He didn't scream, didn't run in a panic, but his entire body changed. His shoulders hunched, his breath grew short. His eyes began to sweep the lot with an urgency that contradicted his outward calm. Helen felt her own heart race. She rose from the crate where she was sitting and began to search too, moving among the piles of materials carefully so as not to disturb Joe's organization. The silence between them was heavy, laden with a fear neither of them verbalized. They found Ben a few yards away, hidden behind a mountain of cardboard. He had found an injured cat and was trying to build a kind of shelter for the animal using pieces of box and fabric. He was so focused on his rescue mission that he hadn't noticed the worry he was causing. Joe's expression, when he saw his son, revealed more than any words could convey, fear dissolving into relief, love manifesting as contained anger, the exhaustion of someone living in a permanent state of alert, but also a fierce determination to continue no matter the cost. He crouched before Ben and held the boy's shoulders with gentle firmness. He said nothing for a long moment. He just looked into his son's eyes with an intensity that carried decades of feeling in seconds of silence. Then he kissed Ben's forehead and stood up, returning to work as if nothing had happened. Helen understood at that instant that there was much more to that story than poverty or bad luck. There was a constant struggle against giving up. Every day Joe woke up and kept going was a victory against a world that seemed determined to destroy him. Every smile from Ben was proof that love can flourish even in the most arid soil. The injured cat became part of their routine. Ben cared for it with the same dedication he gave to broken objects, feeding it scraps he saved from his own meals, building increasingly elaborate shelters to protect it from the sun and rain. Joe pretended not to see, but Helen noticed how he checked on the animal when he thought no one was looking. With time, the atmosphere of the landfill began to transform inside Helen. It was no longer just an ugly, forgotten place. It was a space that revealed truths she herself had avoided looking at for a long time. Every gesture of Joe's carried a humanity she didn't find in the luxurious environments she frequented. Every invention of Ben's reminded her that there is still hope, even when the world insists on denying it. Their emotional closeness intensified when Helen tried to help Joe fix something simple. It was a disassembled chair he intended to salvage and sell. She offered to hold the pieces while he worked, eager to contribute in some way other than just bringing food or her presence. The piece slipped from her hands. It was a small, almost childish error, but the embarrassment Helen felt was disproportionate. Her cheeks flushed, and she apologized repeatedly, feeling useless in an environment where survival demanded skills she had never needed to develop. It was Ben who saved the moment. The boy approached naturally, took the pieces from her hands, and with a concentration that seemed to absorb the world around him, assembled everything flawlessly. His small fingers knew exactly where each joint went, how each screw turned, what pressure to apply to each connection. Helen felt a knot in her chest, not for her own inadequacy, but for perceiving the intelligence and sensitivity Ben carried, despite everything life had denied him. That boy, who had never set foot in a formal school, who had never had access to educational toys or patient teachers, had an intuitive understanding of how things worked that many engineers would take years to develop. Joe watched the scene in silence, as always. His eyes were fixed on his son, and in them Helen saw something that deeply moved her. It was pride, yes, but it was also sadness. The sadness of a father who knows his son deserves more than he can offer. The sadness of someone who sees potential being wasted, not for lack of talent, but for lack of opportunity. That night, on the way back home, Helen cried. Not out of pity, not out of guilt. She cried because she had found beauty where the world saw only misery, and that beauty, once seen, could no longer be ignored. Conflicts at home began to take more definite shape. Richard no longer ignored Helen's absences, and the questions he once avoided now emerged in tense conversations during silent dinners. He didn't understand, and perhaps didn't want to understand. To a man who measured the world in numbers and results, Helen's choices seemed a waste of resources, time, and energy that could be directed toward more productive things. One evening, he finally verbalized what he'd been holding back. They were in the living room, each in their usual corner, when Richard lowered the tablet where he was reading reports and looked at his wife with an expression that mixed frustration and genuine incomprehension. What do you get out of this, Helen? The question hung in the air for long seconds. Helen knew that tone. It was the same one he used in business meetings when questioning the viability of an investment. She was now a project that yielded no return, an allocation of emotional capital that made no sense in his spreadsheets. "You wouldn't understand," she replied, and immediately regretted it. Not because the answer was false, but because she knew it would sound like evasion, like an excuse from someone without solid arguments. "Try to explain it to me." Richard crossed his arms, the gesture simultaneously an invitation and a challenge. "Because from my perspective, you're getting involved with people who can't give you anything in return. And before you accuse me of being insensitive, I'm talking about any kind of exchange. Emotional, intellectual, social. What do these people have to offer?" Helen felt anger rise in her chest, but she held it back. Exploding would be to give him reason, to confirm that she was acting on impulse, on a whim, out of a need to feel good that was, deep down, just disguised vanity. She needed better arguments, even if she knew no argument would be sufficient for someone who didn't want to see. "They offer me truth," she finally said. "A truth I don't find anywhere else." Richard shook his head, the gesture carrying more pity than irritation. "You're romanticizing poverty, Helen. It's easy to see beauty in misery when you can come back here at the end of the day, when you have a choice." The accusation hurt because there was a seed of truth in it. Helen had a choice. Joe and Ben didn't. She could come and go. She could observe that life without ever truly having to live it. This asymmetry bothered her more than any external criticism because it came from within, from an honesty with herself that she couldn't avoid. But there was something Richard couldn't perceive, something that perhaps only made sense to someone who had been there, sitting on an improvised crate, sharing silences that spoke more than years of elegant conversations. The truth Helen found at the landfill wasn't about romanticizing poverty. It was about recognizing that her own wealth was empty, that the comforts she had accumulated over decades hadn't filled the void she could finally name. Her friends were even less understanding. At the next Sunday brunch, surrounded by women who wore the same armor of jewels and rehearsed smiles, Helen faced an interrogation disguised as concern. "Honey, are you all right?" The question came from Christine, the oldest of the group, whose frankness often bordered on cruelty. "Because this whole thing about visiting scavengers, you have to admit it's at least eccentric." The others agreed with murmurs and exchanged glances. Helen felt surrounded not by friends, but by a jury that had already rendered its verdict before even hearing the defense. "They're not scavengers, they're people," she replied, keeping her voice calm despite the pressure in her chest. "A father and a son who lost everything and are trying to survive. And what do you intend to do? Adopt them?" Christine laughed, and the sound cut the air like glass. "Look, Helen, charity is wonderful. We all do our part, donate to the right organizations, support the right causes. But there's a difference between helping and getting personally involved with people who, frankly, don't belong in our world." Helen looked around the table. She saw familiar faces, women with whom she had shared decades of luncheons, events, and confidences. But in that moment, they seemed like strangers, inhabitants of a planet whose language she no longer fully understood. "And what would our world be, Christine?" Helen asked, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice. "This one? Where we pretend to care about others as long as they keep their distance. Where we measure people's worth by what they can give us in return." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. The other. Women avoided Helen's eyes, focusing on their plates with disproportionate intensity. The clinking of silverware against fine china seemed louder than it should, filling the void the words had left. Christine maintained her gaze, but there was something different in it now. It was no longer judgment, it was something closer to fear, as if Helen's words had touched a truth they all preferred to keep buried under layers of routine and pretense. No one wanted to admit that their own lives might be as empty as Helen was suggesting, that their own choices might be as automatic and devoid of real purpose. The brunch ended earlier than usual. Helen left first, feigning an appointment that didn't exist, and drove straight to the landfill, needing that space like someone needing air after almost drowning. When she arrived, she found Joe sitting on his usual crate, resting during his mid-afternoon break. Ben was playing further on, building something with pieces of metal he had found. The injured cat, now recovered, slept curled up in a shady corner. Helen parked and got out of the car without the hesitation that had marked her first visits. She walked to where Joe was and sat on the crate beside him, without asking permission, without waiting for an invitation. They remained silent for a long time, watching Ben work on his creation. "Rough day?" Joe finally asked, and there was something in his voice Helen hadn't expected. It wasn't curiosity or superficial interest, it was real empathy, the recognition of someone who knows the weight certain expressions carry. Helen wanted to laugh at the irony. Here she was, surrounded by privileges Joe would never have, receiving comfort from a man who lived by scavenging what others threw away. But she didn't laugh. Because there was no irony, only a simple truth that transcended the material differences between them. "People don't understand," she said, "and I don't know how to explain it anymore." Joe nodded slowly, the gesture carrying decades of understanding. "People rarely understand what they don't want to see," he replied, "and what you're seeing here, what you're finding, is something that threatens the way they organize their world." Helen looked at him with surprise. It was the longest sentence he had ever said in her presence, and it contained a depth she hadn't expected. Joe noticed her gaze and shrugged, an almost embarrassed gesture. "I wasn't always this," he said, gesturing vaguely around him. "I went to college, had a career, read a lot of books before I ended up here. Poverty doesn't erase what you learned, it just takes away the chance to use it." The revelation opened a door Helen hadn't known was closed. She had always known, intuitively, that there was more to Joe than met the eye. But hearing it from him, in his own words, changed something. It brought them closer in a way that wasn't just emotional, but intellectual. "What did you study?" she asked, genuinely interested. "Engineering." Joe smiled, and the smile carried an equal measure of bitterness and longing. "I got my master's too, specializing in mechanical systems. I worked at a major firm, designing systems you probably use without knowing it. Machines that operate in hospitals, in factories, in places where precision is the difference between life and death. Then Martha's illness came, and one thing led to another. And one day I woke up here without really understanding how I got here. It's funny how life can take you from one extreme to another so quickly you don't even notice the path." Helen fell silent, processing. She thought of all the engineers she knew through Richard, confident men who frequented the same events, drank the same wines, talked about the market with the same irritating certainty. None of them seemed more than a few wrong turns away from where Joe was now. The difference wasn't merit, it was luck, circumstance, the cruel randomness of an illness that chose the wrong family. "Do you miss it?" she asked. Joe took a moment to answer. His eyes were fixed on Ben, who was now testing his creation, making it spin and emit sounds that seemed a mix of music and mechanics. "I miss being able to give him what he deserves," he finally said. "The rest, the career, the status, the things I thought were important, I don't miss that. But seeing my son grow up here, knowing he has so much potential and so little opportunity, that hurts every day." Joe's brutal honesty touched Helen in a way more elaborate words never could. She understood at that moment that what attracted her to that place wasn't compassion or guilt or romanticism. It was recognition. There was something of herself lost in his quiet, strength, an authenticity she had abandoned at some point in her life without realizing when or how. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues that seemed impossible for a place so marked by the functional ugliness of the landfill. Helen looked around and saw beauty where before there had only been discard. She saw order where others would see chaos. She saw dignity where the world insisted on seeing only misery. And she knew, with a certainty that needed no arguments, that she wouldn't go back. The weeks wove a routine Helen never imagined possible. Her mornings started early now, not out of obligation, but with a pleasant eagerness of someone who has somewhere to go and someone who matters to be present for. She drove through the still, empty streets, watching the city awaken through her car window, and felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. At the landfill, Joe and Ben waited for her without waiting. There were no plans, no scheduled times. But when she arrived, Ben ran to the fence with that smile that lit up the entire lot, and Joe looked up from his work with a brief nod that meant welcome back. Helen began to bring things that made sense in that context. Tools she bought at specialized stores, telling herself they were justifiable investments. Books for Ben, chosen carefully from those that could feed his mechanical curiosity. Clothes for both of them, always discreet, always practical, never anything that might seem ostentatious charity. Joe accepted some things and refused others, and Helen learned to read those boundaries. Tools were accepted because they improved his working capacity. Books for Ben were accepted because they were for the boy, not for him. But anything that suggested she was trying to solve their situation that he rejected with gentle firmness. "You can't save us," he said one afternoon when Helen casually mentioned the possibility of helping him find a job. "I mean, you could try, but that's not what I need." Helen remained silent, waiting for him to continue. She had learned that Joe spoke in his own time, and pressing him only made the words retreat. "What I need," he continued, "is for Ben to have a chance. Not now, because he's still too young. But when the time comes, he needs to be ready to seize any opportunity that appears. And for that, he needs to learn. He needs to study. He needs to know things I can't teach him alone." Helen understood what he was asking without asking. It wasn't money. It wasn't rescue. It was a partnership in a larger project. Ben's education, an investment in the boy's future that didn't depend on charity, but on joint dedication. "I can help with that," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Not because you need it, but because I want to. Because Ben deserves to have someone who believes in him besides you." Joe looked at her for a long moment, measuring the sincerity behind her words. Then he nodded, once, and that gesture sealed an agreement that would irreversibly transform their relationship. Helen began to bring educational materials. Notebooks, pencils, books on literacy and basic math. She sat with Ben for an hour every day, teaching him to read and write, discovering with him the secrets of numbers and letters. The boy absorbed knowledge with a surprising veracity. In weeks, he was reading complete sentences. In months, he was devouring entire books she brought from the bookstore. Ben's intelligence was even more impressive up close. He made connections that adults would take hours to perceive, found patterns where others saw only randomness, questioned everything with a curiosity that seemed inexhaustible. Helen felt a strange, almost maternal pride, watching the boy flourish under her guidance. Joe observed from afar, working on his piles of materials, but always attentive to what was happening. His eyes regularly lifted, checking if Ben was understanding, if Helen was being patient, if everything was going well in that improvised classroom. Sometimes, when Ben faced a difficulty, he would approach and offer a discreet hint, revealing knowledge that confirmed everything he had said about his previous life. He was a natural teacher, and Helen realized how painful it must be for him not to be able to dedicate all his time to his son's education. The silent frustration of an intelligent man trapped in circumstances he didn't choose was visible in small gestures, in glances that lasted a second longer, in sighs he tried to hide but that Helen had learned to recognize. The dynamic among the three deepened in ways none of them had anticipated. There were now long conversations during work breaks, discussions about subjects that went far beyond immediate survival. Joe spoke about his time as an engineer, about the projects he had developed, about the theories that still fascinated him. Helen shared fragments of her own life, carefully edited to avoid embarrassment, but increasingly honest. One day, Ben asked Helen if she had children. The question came without warning, with that naturalness of children who haven't yet learned to filter their curiosities. Helen fell silent for a moment, feeling the weight of that simple word that carried so many layers of meaning. "No," she finally replied. "My husband and I never had children." Ben nodded, processing the information with his characteristic seriousness. Then he looked at her with those eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances and asked, "Did you wish you had?" Helen felt tears well up before she could control them. It was a question she had avoided asking herself for decades, a wound she had kept closed with layers of rational justifications and practical conformity. Doctors had said it was possible, that there were no physical impediments, that the choice was theirs. But Richard always had a reason to postpone. First his career, then hers, then the wrong time, then the unstable market. The years passed, and the possibility became increasingly remote, until one day she realized it was no longer a possibility. But there, before that boy who had nothing but genuine curiosity, her defenses didn't work. "I think so," she whispered. "I think I did." Joe approached discreetly, sensing the fragility of the moment. His eyes met Helen's, and in them she saw not pity, but understanding. The understanding of someone who also carried losses that couldn't be named aloud. Ben, perhaps intuiting he had crossed an invisible line, changed the subject with surprising social dexterity he sometimes demonstrated. He began to show her a new project he was working on, a complex mechanism that transformed the movement of a wheel into musical sounds. The tension dissipated, but something had changed. A door had been opened, and none of them yet knew what lay on the other side. At home, the situation with Richard deteriorated into increasingly longer silences. He no longer asked questions, which was worse than confrontations. His indifference hurt more than irritation, because it revealed how far apart they had drifted over the years without realizing it. One evening, as they dined on opposite sides of the too large table, Helen tried to share something about her day. She spoke about Ben's progress, about how the boy had finally understood a mathematical concept he had been struggling with for weeks. She spoke with enthusiasm, forgetting for a moment that her audience wasn't interested. Richard listened until the end, chewing his food with the same expression he used when listening to reports from departments that didn't interest him. When she finished, he simply nodded and asked if she wanted dessert. The answer, or lack thereof, crystallized something Helen had been feeling for a long time. They were no longer a couple. They were two people who shared a space out of convenience, out of habit, out of fear of confronting what it would mean to admit failure. Love, if it still existed, was buried under so many layers of routine and distance that it was no longer recognizable. That night, Helen lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom she shared with a stranger. She thought of Joe, how he spoke of Martha with a longing that still hurt after years. She thought of the love he demonstrated for Ben with every gesture, every look, every protective silence, and she compared it to the emptiness of her own marriage, where words were functional and touches non-existent. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider possibilities that had once seemed unthinkable. She didn't yet know what she would do, what decisions she would make, what paths she would choose, but she knew she couldn't continue pretending that the life she was living was sufficient, not after having seen, in the most improbable place, what life could be when lived with truth. Sleep came late, restless and full of fragmented dreams. In one of them, she was at the landfill, but not as a visitor. She was there to stay, working alongside Joe, teaching Ben under the improvised tarp that served as a classroom. Richard appeared in the distance, waving goodbye without sadness or anger, just the indifference of someone bidding farewell to a person they never truly knew. She woke with the sun already high, late for a social engagement she couldn't remember, but instead of jumping out of bed in a panic, she stayed there for a few more minutes, letting the dream slowly dissipate as she understood, with growing clarity, that something fundamental had changed within her, and that something had no turning back. The crisis began with an unending rain. Whole days of water falling without respite, transforming the landfill into a dangerous mud pit. Helen couldn't visit them, and her worry grew with each hour that passed without news. She tried to call a number Joe had given her for emergencies, an old cell phone that worked when there was a signal, but the calls wouldn't connect. She drove to the entrance of the lot twice, but the road was impassable, and she had to turn back before getting stuck in the mud. On the third morning, when the rain finally let up, Helen left home before dawn. She drove through the soaked streets with an urgency she didn't try to disguise. When she arrived at the landfill, her heart pounded at the sight of the lot. Piles of materials had collapsed, Joe and Ben's improvised shelter had a partially destroyed roof, and there was a stillness in the air that felt wrong. She got out of the car, uncaring about the mud that swallowed her shoes. The lot was transformed, unrecognizable. Puddles of dirty water covered paths she once knew by heart. She walked quickly, then ran, calling. For Joe, for Ben, feeling panic grow with each second of silence. Her heart beat so hard she could hear it in her own ears, a desperate drum marking each uncertain step on the muddy ground. Where there had once been order, now there was destruction. Where there had once been routine, now there was chaos. And the silence, that heavy silence the rain had left behind, seemed to hold secrets she was afraid to uncover. She found them at the back of the lot, in a higher area Helen had never explored. Joe had built an improvised platform there, using pallets and tarps where they had taken refuge during the storm. Ben slept huddled in damp blankets, and Joe sat beside him, awake, watching over his son's sleep, with eyes that carried entire nights of vigil. When he saw Helen, something on his face changed. It wasn't exactly relief, but perhaps something close. A softening of the lines of tension he had carried for days. "Are you all right?" Helen asked, breathless, kneeling beside them, uncaring about the water soaking her clothes. Joe nodded. "We are. It was tough, but we're okay." Helen looked around, seeing the destruction the rain had caused. Weeks of work organizing materials, creating systems, building a possible life within the impossible, all ruined in a few days of storm. "You lost everything," she said, and there was genuine pain in her voice. "Not everything." Joe looked at Ben, who was beginning to stir at the sound of voices. "I didn't lose what matters." The simple sentence carried a truth Helen absorbed like a physical impact. Here was a man who had lost more than she ever would, facing an additional tragedy with a serenity that defied logic. And yet, even with everything crumbling around him, his first response was gratitude for what remained. Ben opened his eyes, and upon seeing Helen, smiled with that unconditional joy of children who haven't yet learned to moderate their affections. He ran to her and hugged her with thin arms that seemed stronger than they should be. and Helen felt tears stream down her face without shame. "I was so worried about you two," she murmured against the boy's damp hair. "I couldn't stop thinking." "We're okay, Aunt Helen." Ben had been using that title for a few weeks, an affectionate formality that had emerged spontaneously. Dad took care of everything. He always does. Helen looked at Joe over Ben's head. Their eyes met, and in that gaze there was something neither of them had allowed before. An intimacy that transcended the friendship they had built. A recognition that more than convenience or compassion existed there. Joe looked away first, breaking the moment with the practicality that was his armor. "We need to rebuild," he said, standing and looking around. "It'll take time, but I've done this before." "I'll help," Helen offered immediately. "And before you refuse, it's not charity, it's a partnership. You've already done so much for me without even knowing it." Joe looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully decipher. There was gratitude there, but also caution, and something else, something he seemed to be fighting to keep hidden. "All right," he finally said. "Partnership." The following days were filled with intense work. Helen arrived early and stayed late, helping to reorganize what was salvageable, discarding what was no longer useful, building new systems in more protected areas. Her hands, which had never done manual labor, developed calluses and scratches that she displayed with secret pride. Ben divided his time between helping and studying, maintaining the learning routine they had established even amidst the chaos of reconstruction. Helen admired the boy's adaptability, the way he found normalcy even in the most abnormal circumstances. One afternoon, while they worked side by side separating metals from plastics, Joe began to talk about Martha, not like before, in measured fragments, but in a more complete way. He recounted how they met in college, how she was the smartest person he had ever met, how the diagnosis came in the same month they discovered they were expecting Ben. "She knew she wouldn't get to know him," Joe said, and his voice carried an ancient sadness that time hadn't diluted. "She knew from the start. But she decided to have him anyway because she said she wanted to leave something of herself in the world, and she did. She left him." Helen listened in silence, understanding that there were no adequate words to respond with, only presence, only witnessing. "In her last months," Joe continued, "she made sure to teach me everything about taking care of a baby. She spent hours showing me how to change a diaper, how to bathe him, how to soothe colic, how to recognize different kinds of cries. I thought she was exaggerating, that I'd learn with time, that I didn't need so many repeated lessons. Only later did I understand that she was saying goodbye. She was preparing me to do alone what we had planned to do together. Each lesson was a love letter she left for the future, a manual for a father who would also need to be a mother." Helen felt tears stream down her face, but didn't try to hide them. Crying there in that place with that man didn't feel like weakness. It felt like the only honest response possible. "You are so strong," she finally said, "stronger than anyone I know." Joe shook his head. "It's not strength, it's lack of choice. When you have a child who depends on you, giving up isn't an option. You just keep going, one day at a time, until days turn into weeks and weeks turn into years, and you realize you survived without planning." His brutal honesty hit her as always. There was no romanticized heroism in his words, only the raw reality of someone doing what needs to be done, because there is no alternative. "I wish I'd had that chance," Helen confessed, surprising herself with her own honesty. "To have someone who depended on me, someone who forced me to keep going even when I wanted to give up." Joe looked at her with attention. "Why did you never have children? You don't have to answer if you don't want to." Helen took a deep breath, organizing thoughts she rarely allowed to surface. "Richard never wanted them. In the beginning, I accepted it because I thought we had time. Then time passed, And he still didn't want them, and I convinced myself that I didn't either. But it wasn't true. It was never true. I was just afraid to admit that I had given up something that mattered to please someone who would never thank me for it. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and liberating at the same time. Helen didn't know why she was saying these things to Joe, a man she had known for only a few months at a landfill at the end of the world. But there was something in him that drew out truths she couldn't say anywhere else. "There's still time," Joe said softly, "for many things. You're not as old as you think, and the world is bigger than the life you're living." Helen smiled, a sad expression that recognized the kindness without fully accepting the comfort. "Maybe," she replied, "maybe there's time for some things." They continued working in silence after that, but the silence had a different quality now. It was a shared silence, not empty, a silence that spoke more than words ever could. When the sun began to set, Helen said goodbye as always, but before she left, she did something she had never done. She approached Joe and hugged him. Not a casual, friendly hug, but an embrace that carried everything they had shared that afternoon: gratitude, recognition, and something more that neither of them was ready to name. Joe hesitated for a second, then returned the embrace. His arms around her were firm and gentle at the same time, and Helen felt, for the first time in years, what it was to be held by someone who truly cared. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair. "For everything." Helen didn't answer. She didn't trust her voice at that moment. She simply nodded, pulled away, and walked to her car with steps that seemed lighter despite the mud that still covered the lot. On the way back home, she knew, with a certainty that needed no arguments, that her life was about to change irreversibly. And for the first time, instead of fear, she felt something close to hope. The decision came gradually, built in layers of courage Helen didn't know she possessed. Each passing day, each hour at the landfill, each exchanged glance with Joe, and each smile from Ben added more certainty to what was already inevitable. She could no longer live two lives. She could no longer pretend that the existence she led with Richard had meaning when all her meaning was elsewhere. The conversation happened on a night like any other. Helen had prepared for days, rehearsing phrases she could never complete, imagining reactions that oscillated between indifference and fury. But when she finally sat opposite Richard, with the dinner table between them like a trench, the words came out simpler than she expected. "I need to tell you something," she began, and there was a firmness in her voice that surprised her. Richard looked up from his phone, registering perhaps for the first time in months that she was truly there. His expression was neutral, professional, the same he used in meetings where he needed to hear bad news before deciding how to react. "I'm not happy anymore," Helen continued, "and I don't think you are either. We're together out of habit, out of convenience, out of fear of admitting we made a mistake somewhere along the way. But that's not enough. Not for me. Not anymore." The silence that followed was long but not uncomfortable. Helen watched Richard process the information with the same efficiency with which he analyzed spreadsheets. There was no surprise on his face, only a belated recognition of something he probably also knew but preferred to ignore. "Does this have to do with those people?" he finally asked. "The man and the boy from the landfill?" Helen thought about lying, about protecting that part of her life from his grasp, but lies would no longer serve. If she was determined to live with truth, she needed to start now. "It does," she admitted, "but not in the way you're imagining. It's not an affair, if that's what you're thinking. It's something else. It's finding a place where I feel real, where what I do truly matters, where there's meaning beyond appearances and routines." Richard nodded slowly, and Helen realized with surprise that he understood. He didn't agree, probably never would, but he understood. His comprehension disarmed her more than any confrontation would have. "And what do you want to do?" he asked, with the practicality that was his hallmark. "I want to leave. I want to start over. Not necessarily with them. I'm not proposing anything melodramatic. But I want a different life than the one we built, and I think you deserve a chance to find someone who wants what you want." "Because I don't want it anymore, Richard. I haven't for a long time." The conversation continued for hours, moving through territories they had avoided for the entire duration of their marriage. They spoke about frustrated expectations, about plans that never materialized, about a love that perhaps had never been as deep as they both pretended. They talked about the honeymoon trip that never happened, about the beach house they bought and never used, about friends who drifted away without anyone noticing when or why. It was painful, but also liberating, like cleaning an old wound to finally let it heal. When the sun began to lighten the sky outside the windows, they were still talking, exhausted but strangely at peace with what they had decided. When Helen went to bed that night, she slept in the guest room, not out of anger or punishment, but because the gesture symbolized something that needed to be symbolized, a separation that had already existed for years, finally recognized and named. In the following days, while attorneys were consulted and logistics planned, Helen continued going to the landfill. She didn't tell Joe what was happening. She didn't want him to feel responsible or guilty for a decision that was entirely hers. But he noticed the change in her, the lightness that replaced an old tension, and his eyes asked questions his mouth didn't verbalize. One afternoon, while Ben was studying intently on a science lesson Helen had prepared, Joe approached and sat beside her in silence. They remained like that for a while, observing the boy until he finally spoke. "Something has changed in you," he said without looking directly at her. "You seem different, lighter." Helen smiled, and the smile was genuine in a way it hadn't been for a long time. "I'm separating," she said, "from my husband, from the marriage, from an entire life that wasn't mine." Joe remained silent for a long moment, processing the information. When he finally looked at her, his eyes held genuine concern. "Because of us?" "No." Helen was emphatic. She needed him to understand. "Because of me. You showed me what I wanted, that's true, but the decision is mine. The responsibility is mine. I was unhappy long before I met you. I just didn't have the courage to admit it." Joe nodded, and the relief on his face was visible. "I didn't want to be the reason you destroyed anything," he confessed. "I've already destroyed too many things in my own life. Didn't need to carry yours, too." His brutal honesty, as always, disarmed her. Helen reached out and touched his arm, a small gesture that carried a lot. "You didn't destroy anything, Joe. You built. You and Ben built something I didn't know I needed, and I will be eternally grateful for that." They fell silent after that, but the silence had a new quality, a possibility that hadn't existed before. Neither of them had named it yet. Neither was ready to give words to something so fragile and new, but it was there, palpable, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Ben finished his lesson and ran to them with his characteristic animation. "Look, Aunt Helen, I got everything right," he said, proudly displaying his notebook, "even the hard fraction part." Helen took the notebook and examined it with genuine attention. Every correct answer, every well-executed calculation represented a victory against all odds. That boy, who had never set foot in a formal school, who learned in a landfill under an improvised tarp, was exceeding expectations many privileged students didn't achieve. "You're amazing," she said, and there were tears in her eyes she didn't try to hide. "You know that, don't you? That you're absolutely amazing." Ben smiled, half embarrassed, half proud. "Dad says that too, that I'm smart, that I'll do great things someday." "And you will." Helen looked at Joe as she spoke. "Both of you will. I don't know how yet, but you will." The promise hung in the air, carrying a weight they all felt. It wasn't an empty promise, one of those made to console. It was a commitment Helen intended to fulfill, no matter the cost. The following weeks brought the realization of the separation. Helen and Richard divided their assets with a civility that surprised them both. There were no fights, no petty disputes, just the recognition that they were freeing each other from a prison neither of them wanted to inhabit anymore. Helen kept the apartment, not because she needed so much space, but because Richard didn't want it, and she had nowhere else to go immediately. She would sell it later, when she decided what to do with her new life. For now, it served as a base while she redesigned her future. Her friends reacted to the news with a mixture of shock and fascination. Some pulled away, unable to deal with the transgression Helen represented, with the audacity of choosing something different when conformity was so much easier. Others drew closer, curious or sympathetic or both, wanting to understand what had motivated such a radical decision. In this process, Helen discovered which connections were real and which were merely conventional. True friendships survived and even strengthened. False ones dissolved, without leaving a trace of longing, like mist in the morning sun. Christine was the biggest surprise. The same woman who had criticized her visits to the landfill appeared one day at her apartment, unannounced, with a bottle of wine and an expression Helen couldn't decipher. "I came to apologize," she said, sitting on the sofa as if she were at home. "For everything I said. For all the judgments. I was jealous, Helen, jealous that you had the courage to do what I never did." The confession opened a conversation that lasted hours and revealed layers of Christine Helen hadn't known. The unhappiness in her marriage, the abandoned dreams, the constant feeling of living someone else's life. They discovered they were more alike than they imagined, just with different capacities for pretense. But the most important discovery came one ordinary afternoon at the landfill. Helen had arrived at her usual time and found Joe working on a special project. He was building something for Ben, an elaborate structure that combined pieces of metal, wood, and plastic in a design she couldn't identify. "What is it?" she asked, crouching beside him to get a better look. Joe smiled, and there was a joy in that smile she rarely saw. "A birthday surprise. It's a week away, and I wanted to make something special. It's a bigger version of that mechanism he invented, the one that transforms movement into music. Only this one will really work." Helen observed the work in progress, admiring the complexity and beauty of what was taking shape. Every gear, every connection, every detail revealed not just technical skill, but love. A love that manifested in hours of hidden work, in careful planning, in absolute dedication. "He's going to love it," she said softly. "And you're amazing for being able to make this with what you have available." Joe shrugged, but there was pride in his modest gesture. "You do what you can with what you have. It's always been that way." Helen kept looking at him for a long moment, feeling something grow in her chest that she could no longer ignore. It wasn't just admiration or respect or gratitude. It was something deeper, more dangerous, more inevitable. "Joe," she began, but he interrupted her with a look. "I know," he said simply. "Me too." And in that moment, with those minimal words that said everything, the invisible line they had respected for months was finally crossed. There was no kiss, no embrace, just the recognition that something existed between them that could no longer be denied. "What do we do now?" Helen asked, and her voice trembled slightly. Joe looked at the horizon, where the sun began its daily descent. "We keep going, one day at a time, until we find out what comes next." It was the same philosophy he applied to survival, now extended to something much more complex. Helen nodded, understanding that there were no ready answers, no guarantees, only the possibility of something new growing slowly in the most improbable soil. And for the first time, that was enough. Ben's birthday was the turning point none of them had planned. Helen arrived early that day, even before the sun had finished rising, bringing a cake she had ordered from a simple neighborhood bakery, without ostentation, without the excesses that marked the parties she used to frequent. The cake was chocolate, Ben's favorite flavor, decorated only with a few red berries and the boy's name written in white frosting. She also brought a gift wrapped in colorful paper, a real professional toolkit, carefully chosen for small hands that did big things. Each piece had been tested in the store, each tool evaluated for weight and size, to ensure Ben could use them comfortably. Joe had finished his secret project during the night, working by flashlight while Ben slept. The structure was assembled in a protected corner, covered by an old cloth that hid the surprise. When Helen saw the expectation in his eyes, the anxiety of someone who wanted everything to be perfect, her heart tightened in a way she didn't know. Ben woke to Happy Birthday, being sung by two voices that blended in imperfect, beautiful harmony. His eyes widened at the sight of the cake, the lit candles, the improvised celebration that transformed that piece of landfill into something sacred. He blew out the candles with force, his eyes closed on a wish he never revealed, and then hugged his father with an intensity that said everything. The gifts came next. The toolkit drew exclamations of genuine joy, each piece examined with the reverence of someone receiving treasures. But it was Joe's structure that stole the show. When the cloth was removed, revealing the elaborate mechanism that transformed movement into music, Ben remained silent for a long moment, not out of disappointment, but out of wonder, out of recognition, out of a love that couldn't be contained in words. "Dad," he whispered, approaching the creation with careful steps. "You made this for me." Joe nodded, unable to speak. There were tears in his eyes he didn't try to hide, and Helen saw in that moment all the vulnerability he kept hidden behind his silent fortress. Here was a father who couldn't give his son what the world considered essential, but who gave what truly mattered: time, dedication, love transformed into a gesture. Ben turned the mechanism's crank, and sounds began to emerge. It wasn't music in the conventional sense, but something more primitive and beautiful. Thumps, clinks, hums that combined into a rhythm that seemed to come from another place. The boy laughed, enchanted, and then ran to hug his father again, squeezing him with all the strength of his thin arms. "It's the best present in the world," he said against Joe's chest. "The best present ever." Helen watched the scene from a distance, feeling like an intruder in such an intimate moment. But Ben wouldn't let her stay out. He ran to her and pulled her by the hand, bringing her into the circle they formed. "Aunt, Helen needs to hear it too," he said, turning the crank again. "She's part of us now." The simple sentence, spoken with the naturalness of children who haven't yet learned to calculate their words, had an impact no elaborate speech could have. Helen looked at Joe and saw in his eyes the same emotion she felt. They were three now, not a family in the traditional sense, not yet, perhaps never in that format, but something that had a name and a form and a future. The celebration continued for hours, fueled by conversations and laughter and the strange, beautiful sound of Ben's mechanism. When the cake was cut, each piece was savored with a slowness Helen had never experienced. There was no rush. There was nowhere else to be. Just that moment, that space, those people. Late in the afternoon, while Ben played with his new tools, Joe and Helen sat side by side in silence. The sun dipped once more, painting the sky in colors that seemed exclusive to that place. There was peace in the air, a quietude that came from within, not from without. "I've made a decision," Helen finally said, breaking the silence softly. "About what?" To do with my life. Joe looked at her, waiting without pressing. I'm going to open a school. Helen smiled, seeing the surprise on his face. Not a traditional school, a learning space for vulnerable children, a place where intelligences like Ben's can be recognized and developed. I'm going to use the money from selling the apartment to start. The magnitude of the decision hung between them. It wasn't charity, it wasn't a whim, it was purpose. A way to transform everything Helen had learned in those months into something concrete and lasting. And Ben would be the first student? Joe asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. The first of many. Helen met his eyes and held his gaze. But he wouldn't just be a student. He would be the reason, the inspiration, the proof that potential exists everywhere, even where the world refuses to look. Joe remained silent for a long time, processing what she had said. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something Helen had never heard before. It was hope, a real, concrete hope that dared to imagine a different future. You would do that? You'd really do that? I'm already doing it. Helen smiled. I've already talked to attorneys, looked for properties, started planning. It's not a dream, Joe. It's a project, and I want you involved. Not as a beneficiary, but as a partner. You understand construction, systems, making a lot with a little. I need those skills. The school needs them. The proposal changed something on Joe's face. The distrust he carried as protection, the resistance to accept anything that looked like a handout, all of it dissolved before the way Helen had phrased the offer. It wasn't a favor. It was recognition of competence. It was an invitation to contribute, not to receive. I don't know if I can do that, he admitted. It's been so long since I was part of anything beyond just surviving. You know more than you think. Helen touched his hand, the gesture both soft and firm. You survived things that would destroy most people. You raised an incredible son under impossible conditions. You built dignity where others would see only misery. Those are skills, Joe, skills no college teaches. They held hands as the sun completed its descent, transforming the sky into a spectacle that seemed disproportionate for such a forgotten place. Ben played in the distance, creating new things with his new tools, the sound of the musical mechanism providing an improbable soundtrack for that moment of transformation. In the months that followed, the project took shape with a speed that surprised everyone involved. Helen sold her apartment and found a suitable property in a neighborhood that lay between worlds, accessible to both privileged children and those from realities like Ben's. It was an old house, with a solid structure and ample spaces that could be adapted for different purposes. The backyard had leafy trees that would provide shade on hot afternoons, and the covered porch would be perfect for outdoor activities. The idea was to create a meeting space where socio-economic differences would dissolve before shared curiosity, where children from completely different backgrounds would learn together and from each other. Joe gradually became involved, first with hesitation, then with a dedication that revealed the professional he had been before everything fell apart. His ideas about space utilization, about organizational systems, about ways to do more with less, proved to be exactly what the project needed. He was no longer a beneficiary, he was a partner, a collaborator, an essential piece of something larger. Ben was moved from the landfill to a small apartment Helen helped them rent, not as charity, but as part of the package that included Joe's work on the project. The boy continued studying, now with access to more resources, but without losing the essence that made him special. His ability to see possibilities where others saw only problems continued to be his hallmark. The school opened its doors on a spring morning with a small group of children representing all strata of society. Ben was among them, not as an exception or a special case, but as an equal. The First day was chaotic and imperfect and absolutely beautiful, exactly as Helen had imagined. Joe observed from a corner, still uncomfortable with his new position, still learning to occupy spaces that had been denied him for so long. But there was something different in his posture now. It was no longer the defensive dignity of someone fighting to keep their head held high against everything. It was the natural dignity of someone who knows they belong, who contributes, who matters. Helen approached him at the end of that first day, exhausted and radiant at the same time. They stood in silence for a moment, looking at the space they had built together, at the children who ran and learned and discovered possibilities. "We did this," she said, and there was disbelief in her voice. "We really did." "You did," Joe corrected. "I just helped." Helen shook her head. "No, we did, and we'll keep doing it. One day at a time, remember?" Joe smiled, and the smile transformed his face in a way she was still learning to recognize. It was the smile of someone rediscovering hope after so long without it. Later that night, Helen returned to the landfill. For the last time, not to work, not to help, just to remember, to honor the improbable place where everything had begun, where she had found what she had spent her whole life searching for without knowing it. The lot was different now. Other scavengers had occupied the space Joe had left, creating their own systems, their own routines of survival. Helen watched from a distance, feeling a mixture of sadness and gratitude. Sadness for what still existed, for the poverty that persisted, for the injustices no individual project could completely resolve. But gratitude too. Gratitude for having had eyes to see, a heart to feel, the courage to act. She stayed there until the sun dipped once more, until the colors of the sky completed their daily cycle of transformation. Then she got in her car and drove home, to the new life she had built, to the future that finally made sense. On the passenger seat beside her was one of the objects Ben had fixed in the early days of their friendship. A hybrid toy, made of pieces from diverse origins, that worked despite all logic. Helen kept it as a memento, as a symbol, as a proof that the most beautiful things sometimes emerge from what others consider disposable. The car drove on as night gently fell over the city. Helen breathed deeply, feeling the air enter her lungs with a lightness she hadn't known before. The path ahead was still uncertain, full of challenges and doubts and fears. But there was also certainty now. The certainty that she was finally where she was meant to be, doing what she was meant to do, being who she always should have been. And that certainty, built gradually in the most improbable place, was all she needed to keep going. If this story touched your heart, like, comment, and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered.